They called it Operation Mongoose. Whole idea was they were going to train these Cuban exiles, you know, for another invasion of Cuba. Well, hell, Banister's office, that was part of the supply line, you know, from Dallas through New Orleans to Miami. They were stockpiling arms, explosives.
All this right under the noses of the intelligence community in Lafayette Square?
Yeah, everybody knew everybody, you know, they were all part of the network. They were all working for the CIA. You know, pilots and then black operators and the civilians and the military. Hell, everybody in those days was running guns somewhere. Fort Jefferson, Bayou Bluff, Morgan City, you name it. Oh, McAllen, Texas, yeah, big gun running operation.
M1, A1, select the switch, fully automatic, like a machine gun.
Banister, now, where does he fit in all this?
Well, he was running his camp up north of Lake Pontchartrain there. You know, Ferry was doing a lot of the training. They had a shooting range, a lot of tropical territory, you know, like you got in Cuba. There's some Americans were trained there, too, a few.
It was a perfect day in Dallas. The sky was clear. The crowds were thick. Flags lined the route like stage dressing. When the president stepped off Air Force One, smiling, relaxed, with his wife just behind him in that now immortal pink dress, nothing about the moment suggested urgency, or danger, or death. But while John F. Kennedy took his first footsteps onto Texas soil, something else was happening hundreds of miles away. Earlier that same day in New Orleans, Carlos Marcello walked into a courtroom with his men at his side, not hiding, not fleeing. Walking in openly prepared to go toe-to-toe with the man who had declared war on him, Robert Kennedy. Marcello had spent years building an empire designed to survive pressure, deportation, indictments, raids. He understood courts. He understood leverage. And that morning, he would walk out with a victory. By nightfall, one brother would be dead in Dallas. The other would be left staring at a crime scene no one could explain. As the motorcade rolled through Dealey Plaza, time bent in small, almost invisible ways. At hospital, doctors and nurses gathered around a television set to watch the procession pass. Among them was Rose Cherami, a woman everyone dismissed, a drug addict, a prostitute, someone already written off. As the cars turned, she spoke without hesitation. This is where he dies. Moments later, the shots came. Kennedy clutched his throat. Governor Connolly twisted, stunned. And then the final shot landed, catastrophic, unmistakable. Anyone on the scene, anyone behind a camera, anyone with binoculars or a scope would have recognized it instantly. A kill shot. What the public never noticed was the pause. Just before that final impact, the limousine slowed, only briefly, long enough for a Secret Service agent running behind the vehicle to catch up and grab hold. Then the accelerator went down. Parkland. Chaos. Dallas froze. Police scattered in every direction. Some ran toward the grassy knoll, others sprinted for the Texas School Book Depository. Inside, officers rushed the stairs to the 6th floor. There they encountered a young man, mid-20s, slight, nervous, scruffy. Guns were drawn, seconds stretched. Then the building manager intervened. He identified the man as an employee. The officers moved on. One of them turned back and gave the man a long look. His name was Lee Harvey Oswald. Within hours, he was under arrest. While Oswald was still alive, the real scramble began. Out of sight, behind closed doors. The FBI, the Justice Department, intelligence officials. Robert Kennedy demanded answers. Tempers flared. Accusations flew. He was told, quietly, that Oswald might have touched intelligence activity tied to Cuba. The whole Cuba mess. Almost immediately, a story appeared. By that evening, newspapers were already printing familiar names. Old confrontations, old photographs, old enemies. One name rose faster than all the others. Carlos Bringuier, a militant Cuban exile leader in New Orleans. The same man who had confronted Oswald weeks earlier. The same man arrested alongside him during a staged street clash over pro-Castro leaflets. Now Bringuier was telling anyone who would listen that Oswald was Castro's man. At the Dallas police station, reporters crowded Oswald. Someone asked about the Fair Play for Cuba committee, but mispronounced it. A man standing just behind the journalists corrected him calmly. It was Jack Ruby. By nightfall, the narrative was everywhere. In Miami, the DRE was already activating. Phone calls went out. Statements were drafted. A special edition of Trinchera was prepared. On its front page, paired photographs of Oswald and Fidel Castro. This wasn't improvisation. It was activation. At nearly the same moment, exile operator John Martino sat at home with his son. He'd kept the boy out of school that day for no clear reason. He worked in the garage, listening to the radio, waiting. He told his son that if anything broke out of Dallas, he was to call him immediately. When the news came, Martino didn't look at the television. He ran for the phone. Within hours, he was telling journalists that Oswald had been sent by Castro, that he'd been to Mexico City, that he'd contacted the Cuban and Soviet embassies, that the trail led to Havana. Weeks earlier, Lee Harvey Oswald had gone south. Mexico City was not a detour. It was the objective. Oswald arrived there attempting to do what he could not do openly in the United States, gain entry into Cuba through official channels. On paper, the story almost worked. A former Marine, a defector who had lived in the Soviet Union, a man publicly associated with pro-Castro activity in New Orleans. If anyone should have been granted passage, it was him. But inside the Cuban and Soviet embassies, the story didn't hold. Oswald's explanations were inconsistent. His urgency felt rehearsed. The Cubans were cautious. The Soviets were colder still. Both concluded the same thing. Whatever Oswald was, he wasn't what he claimed to be. He was rebuffed. But Oswald wasn't moving through Mexico City unseen. One man in particular was positioned to notice him, someone whose job was to know exactly what happened inside the Cuban embassy and who passed through it and why. David Atlee Phillips. Phillips was the CIA's senior covert action specialist for Cuba. His portfolio was propaganda, deniability, and controlled chaos. Years later, Phillips would speak about Oswald in a way that was carefully framed, almost fictional. He described encountering a strange tourist, a man trying and failing to reach Cuba, a nobody. But the details Phillips chose to include were revealing. He claimed he knew Oswald was coming, that he observed him, studied him, evaluated his background, not as a threat, but as a type. A man who appeared Marxist in belief, yet patriotic in temperament. Someone willing to act, someone usable. Phillips would later insist that any training Oswald received, if any, was hypothetical. Designed for Cuba, for Castro, never for an American target. What Phillips never acknowledged was the larger environment Oswald had already stepped into. By the time Oswald reached Mexico City, the underground world he brushed against, exile groups, intelligence cutouts, organized crime intermediaries, was already saturated with talk of contracts on Castro. Those conversations didn't exist in a vacuum. Oswald's own family ties ran close to that world. His uncle was connected to Carlos Marcello's organization, a top-tier earner who would have known about the money, the players, and the attempts surrounding Cuba. Whether casually or deliberately, the idea may have been planted early. If you could get into Russia, maybe you could get into Cuba. By the summer of 1963, Oswald was broke, unemployed, isolated and desperate to matter. A hit on Castro, if such a thing were even possible, would have looked like salvation. A payday, a purpose, a way back into relevance. What Oswald could not have understood was that every step he took toward Cuba made him more valuable as something else. A patsy. While Oswald was in Mexico City, something else occurred, quietly and critically. Calls were placed to the Soviet embassy, calls attributed to Oswald. But the voice on the line wasn't his. The Russian was poor, broken, hesitant, a glaring inconsistency. Oswald spoke Russian fluently. He had lived in the Soviet Union for nearly 3 years. Still, the calls were logged, translated, sent to Washington. And one detail guaranteed they would never be ignored. The name of a known KGB assassination officer was mentioned. That alone ensured the calls would be escalated, filed, and preserved. At some point, the CIA concluded that the man who had physically appeared at the embassies was Lee Harvey Oswald. Days later, another call came in. This time, the caller clearly identified himself. "This is Lee Oswald." That was enough. A cable went out. The FBI was notified. The paper trail hardened into record. During this same window, while Mexico City Station debated the calls, while translations raised quiet questions, the CIA's senior Cuba specialist returned briefly to headquarters. Later, he would describe Oswald as rebuffed, inconsequential, forgettable. What he never explained was why the voice didn't match, or why the record moved forward anyway. Oswald returned to Dallas alone on a bus. Within weeks, the president was dead. And Oswald watched his own life collapse in print. Newspapers branded him a traitor, a former Marine who defected to the Soviet Union, returned with a Russian wife, handed out pro-Castro leaflets, contacted foreign embassies, and murdered the president. Oswald looked into the cameras and said the only true thing he ever said publicly: "I'm just a patsy. A patsy is supposed to disappear cleanly. This one got arrested." So the ending had to be adjusted. 2 days later, Jack Ruby stepped out of the crowd and enforced it. By then, the narrative was sealed. But beneath the public story, something else was unfolding. On the very day Kennedy was killed, Carlos Marcello had walked out of a New Orleans courtroom. Sitting near him that morning were 2 men who had spent years moving through the same shadow world Oswald had just exited: David Ferry, Guy Banister. When the session ended, the machinery shifted. Within hours, an arrest warrant was issued for Ferry. Ferry vanished. He fled Louisiana and surfaced in Houston, inside Marcello's wider logistical and legal orbit. While Oswald was framed on front pages and television screens, Ferry stayed gone. No press, no statements, no cooperation. He didn't return until Oswald was dead. Only then did he come back to New Orleans, calm, defiant, untouched. He denied knowing Oswald, denied involvement, denied the past. 6 months later, Banister was dead. Official cause, a heart attack. When his office was finally examined, investigators found fair play for Cuba committee leaflets. The same style, the same language, stamped with the same address Oswald had used. 544 Camp Street, Banister's operational space. Oswald hadn't invented it. He'd been pointed to it. By the time the evidence surfaced, the men who could explain it were gone, silent or untouchable. And Marcello, the man who had walked into court that morning, remained exactly where he always was. Watching. Oswald never stood a chance of surviving that architecture. When Kennedy was killed, the machinery snapped into motion exactly as it had been conditioned to do, fast, loud, and in one direction only. Not toward New Orleans, not toward Marcello, not toward Ferry or Banister, but outward, across the water, toward Havana. Carlos Bringuier and Lee Harvey Oswald pretending they barely knew each other. That fiction held just long enough to be useful. In public, Bringuier claimed a chance encounter, a single meeting between a patriotic Cuban exile and a deranged Marxist handing out leaflets. Oswald played along. The story worked because it was simple. It also happened to be false. By August 1963, they had crossed paths at least 7 times. 4 of those meetings occurred before Canal Street. That matters because the confrontation on Canal Street wasn't an accident or a discovery. It was the climax of a role that had already been rehearsed. New Orleans in 1963 was a city wired for Cuba. Exile politics bled into intelligence work. Intelligence bled into organized crime, and organized crime bled into money, real money. The Bay of Pigs might have failed publicly, but the infrastructure behind it never disappeared. It simply went quieter, dirtier, and more deniable. Carlos Bringuier sat squarely inside that world. He was DRE, Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, nominally a student group, practically a propaganda arm, and operationally something far less disciplined than its handlers liked to admit. The CIA knew it. Officers like Ted Shackley and William Harvey knew the DRE was becoming volatile, angry at Kennedy, impatient with Washington, convinced they were being betrayed. And they weren't entirely wrong. Into that environment stepped Lee Harvey Oswald. Oswald did not drift into Bringuier's orbit. He targeted it. He found Bringuier's Casa Roca clothing store deliberately. He did not arrive waving Castro pamphlets. He arrived speaking the opposite language, anti-Castro, militant, offering himself as a soldier. Sabotage, training, Cuba. The vocabulary of men who wanted to be taken seriously. Bringuier later claimed this was the first time he had ever seen Oswald. It wasn't. Oswald came back. Then again. Others were present. Names overlapped. Guy Banister, David Ferry. Men who moved comfortably between intelligence, exile circles, and political enforcement. Oswald didn't stumble into that network. He already understood it. And looming behind all of it was Carlos Marcello. Marcello's money ran through New Orleans like groundwater. So did his interest in Cuba. So did his hatred of Robert Kennedy. Marcello wasn't ideological, he was transactional. Castro had taken property. Kennedy was taking power. The exile movement offered a way to strike back at both. By mid-1963, Oswald had found his lane. The Fair Play for Cuba Committee chapter he founded in New Orleans was never meant to exist as a real organization. It was a device, a stage prop, a way to manufacture evidence, paper trails, arrests, photographs, news clippings, that could later be carried into an embassy. Mexico City was the objective, the Soviet embassy, the Cuban embassy, official doors. Oswald needed proof that he was a persecuted pro-Castro activist. He needed to look hunted. That meant public confrontation. On August 9, 1963, Oswald took his place on Canal Street, hostile ground by design. No sane person handed out pro-Castro leaflets in New Orleans unless they wanted trouble or expected it. Oswald expected it. There was already a cameraman waiting. Mike Lala would later say he was simply in the right place at the right time. The police didn't believe that. Neither should anyone else. Bringuier arrived quickly. Too quickly. With other exiles. With props. With outrage already staged. The confrontation escalated exactly as it needed to. Oswald stayed calm. Folded his arms. Invited violence without committing it. Police stepped in. And then protocol broke. Both men were offered a way out. Walk away. No charges, no paperwork. Both refused. Oswald insisted on being arrested. That insistence told the police everything they needed to know without understanding it. Something was being constructed. They booked him anyway. The performance continued. More leaflets, more cameras, a radio debate where Oswald was publicly dismantled, his Soviet defection revealed, his contradictions exposed, his credibility destroyed. To the public, he was finished. To Oswald, the job was done. He had built the perfect persona. And then the ground shifted. What Oswald could not control, and what no one in the exile intelligence crime world had fully accounted for, was Robert Kennedy's war on organized crime. In August 1962, Joseph Valachi came forward, quietly at first, then steadily. He began talking about the mafia not as rumor, but as structure, names, families, hierarchies. By September 1963, Valachi was sworn in before a Senate subcommittee. He confirmed the existence of organized crime on the record. In October, those hearings were broadcast on national television. Millions watched. Plausible deniability evaporated in real time. That changed everything. For the CIA, the rules collapsed overnight. Any covert action touching Cuba that involved Carlos Marcello, David Ferry, the DRE, Guy Banister, John Martino, Santo Trafficante, Loran Hall, Roselli, Sam Giancana, Russell Buffalino, or their networks was no longer deniable. The infrastructure that had once made assassination plots survivable now made them radioactive. At the same time, Kennedy had begun making progress with Castro's second-in-command. Quiet feelers, back channels. The signal was unmistakable. Even if Castro were removed, his successor would remain, and Kennedy would normalize relations anyway. There would be no return of confiscated property, no exile victory, no mafia payday. Cuba was gone, and so the pipeline shut down. The exile raids stopped, the money dried up, the tolerance vanished. Any remaining attempts on Castro involving organized crime were killed not out of morality, but necessity. Oswald was left behind. The persona he had built so carefully now had no destination, no Cuba, no mission, no income. He had been publicly outed as a communist, humiliated on the radio, marked in police files, and abandoned by the very networks that had quietly benefited from his performance. Unless something else presented itself, unless he could prove his worth again, to Banister, to Ferry, to Marcello, to the remnants of a movement that had just lost its reason for existing. 3 months later, John F. Kennedy was dead, and the man who had once tried to get into Cuba through official channels no longer needed a visa. On June 5, 1961, Carlos Marcello was sitting in his office at the Town and Country Motel, fielding phone calls the way a general studies maps. By the time the calls were finished, he was already moving toward Churchill Farms, his private estate. A place that wasn't just secluded but engineered to disappear. One road in, one road out. Gates that looked decorative, security that looked light. That was the trick. The illusion was the protection. The land around it belonged to him. The men watching it belonged to him. Everyone knew who owned Churchill Farms, and everyone knew what it meant to go there uninvited. Carlos Marcello had just returned from deportation, and the United States government still couldn't explain how he had walked back into America like nothing had happened. He had been deported 2 weeks before the Bay of Pigs invasion, and that timing mattered. The shockwaves moved fast, through Washington, through intelligence circles, through organized crime. Marcello wasn't the only one under pressure. In the mid-1950s, the government had tried to deport Vito Genovese and Frank Costello. Others weren't so lucky. Joe Adonis saw what happened to Luciano, sold off his assets, and relocated to Naples and Milan. Across the country, mob bosses learned the same lesson. America was no longer guaranteed ground. New Orleans already understood deportation. Silver Dollar Sam, the real power behind the local syndicate, had been shipped out before. Once in Italy, He linked back up with Luciano, then slipped into Mexico and back into New Orleans. He was arrested again, deported again. And then, later in the 1960s, he came back again. Louisiana and its mafia never separated. They were rooted together, same soil, same water. By 1952, the press was already pointing at the seams. Drew Pearson's Washington merry-go-round laid it out in plain sight. Carlos Marcello and Silvestro Carollo, both tax delinquents, both insulated by federal secrecy. Marcello had already done time in Atlanta for marijuana distribution. Carollo had a record that included bootlegging, narcotics, and attempted murder, plus a gubernatorial pardon that didn't happen by accident. Tax liens followed them like shadows. $76,000 against Marcello and his brother, $62,000 against Carollo, filed, discharged, adjusted. No one outside Washington knew how or why. Local collectors claimed ignorance, records destroyed, decisions made higher up. When Pearson pushed the Internal Revenue Service, the answer never changed. Secrecy statute, prison offense, nothing to discuss. The Secretary of the Treasury made the final call. Not the collectors, not the Bureau. The law protected honest taxpayers, but it protected powerful criminals even better. The public could see the lien, but never the deal that erased it. That silence wasn't accidental, it was structural. In New Orleans, organized crime didn't lean on the state. It was the state. District attorneys, sheriffs, local officials, even senators answered to the same invisible chain. The Huey Long orbit wasn't separate from this system. It intersected with it. Corporate America intersected too. United Fruit depended on organized crime the way arteries depend on blood flow. Perishable goods meant time. Delays meant death. The ports mattered. New Orleans mattered. And the ports were Marcello's. United Fruit had two major strongholds. One ran through Boston, eventually under the Patriarcha organization. The other, more important, more strategic, ran through New Orleans. This was where intelligence and organized crime stopped pretending they were separate. Official stories talked about protecting New York docks after the Normandy burned, but the real concern was Sicily. Military equipment, shipping routes, fascist influence. Operation Underworld wasn't theory, it was logistics. The Office of Strategic Services learned quickly. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers passed through New Orleans during the war, spending money in clubs, casinos, jukebox joints, all owned or controlled by the same people. Marcello didn't just profit, he consolidated. When the war ended, the infrastructure stayed. The relationships stayed. His deportation wasn't just law enforcement, it was interference. The men shaping post-war intelligence weren't naive. They didn't bite the hand that fed them. Truman himself came out of the Pendergast machine. He knew how power actually worked. When the OSS was dismantled in 1945, businessmen, politicians, and intelligence veterans panicked. They needed permanence. Allen Dulles and Tom Dewey pushed the idea forward. The CIA wasn't just about security, it was about continuity. The Mafia already hated communism, not ideologically, structurally. Communism threatened markets, property, leverage. Intelligence officials mistook that alignment for loyalty. They believed they could exile Luciano to Sicily and use him to shape the criminal landscape abroad. They underestimated the organism with which they were dealing. The Mafia didn't serve systems, it absorbed them. United Fruit understood this instinctively. Sam Zemurray had been practicing regime change long before Langley existed. When Charles Matranga died, United Fruit leadership showed up to pay their respects, the old Don of the South. When Sam Zemurray died, the New Orleans Mafia returned the favor. That wasn't symbolism, That was partnership. The CIA's first coup wasn't about democracy or security. It was about land, Guatemala, Arbenz. United Fruit couldn't afford sovereignty. So, sovereignty was removed. The agency learned fast. Control, without visibility, was better than occupation. Law firms like Sullivan and Cromwell turned coups into contracts. Alan Dulles didn't come from bananas. He came from the legal command center that protected them. Oil dynasties, shipping lines, mining interests. They didn't want war. They wanted predictability. Secretive intelligence fed into public intelligence. The OSS became the CIA. Corporate power merged with covert power. Politicians followed. Congress was the real threat, not foreign enemies. So, goodwill was purchased. Careers were built. Nixon's was engineered. CIA intelligence fueled the Alger Hiss case. Campaigns ran on classified material. Elections became infrastructure. The Justice Department left Lansky alone. Immigration backed off. Everyone prospered. Until Cuba. The FBI wasn't a corrective force. It was blackmail institutionalized. Hoover survived Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, because everyone needed him. He tried Kennedy. It didn't work. Then Kennedy died, and Hoover stayed. Power never disappears. It relocates. Studio 54 would prove that decades later. Not a club. A controlled fantasy. Drugs, sex, cameras, leverage. When the lights came on, the photos vanished. Someone always keeps the evidence. Now it was June 5th, 1961, again. Marcello sat with a cigar, calm, insulated. His empire touched United Fruit, oil logistics, Caribbean networks, European cutouts. Operation Gladio. New operations. Old alliances. The Kennedys were pulling threads they didn't understand. They declared war on a structure that predated them. A system embedded in intelligence, corporations, unions, ports, and banks. By targeting Marcello, they hit the hinge. As Kennedy himself said, they kicked a hornet's nest. And the nest never forgives. When Carlos Marcello came back from deportation, he didn't come back to business. He came back to war on a scale he hadn't felt before, because this time the fight wasn't over a racket or a street corner. This time, the fight was over survival. Robert Kennedy had made it personal. Not just raids, not just wiretaps. He'd even hit Marcello's wife with tax charges, demanding over $850,000 in unpaid taxes, roughly $9,214,000 in 2026 money. That isn't pressure. That's a message. We can reach your home, your family, your money, and we can do it in daylight. And Marcello understood something most people never do until it's too late. When the government decides you're the target, every legal weapon becomes a club. Marcello came out of a world that had learned secrecy the hard way. The New Orleans crime family wasn't some flashy new money outfit. It was one of the oldest criminal syndicates in American life. Old enough that its origin story wasn't a rumor. It was a national trauma. In 1891, 11 of these men were targeted and lynched, and the shockwaves didn't stop at the Mississippi. It taught the organization a lesson written in blood: survive by disappearing. Blend legality with criminality. Own property. Buy real estate. Build quietly. Keep your hands clean in public and dirty in private. From the 1900s onward, that's exactly what they did. Turning New Orleans into a fortress disguised as a city. A power base disguised as business. Marcello wasn't operating in fear. He was operating in calculation. He was one of the richest, maybe the richest, mob bosses to ever live. And money changes the kind of war you can fight. He didn't just look at what the government was doing to him. He looked at what the government desperately needed. And in the early 1960s, the Kennedy administration needed one thing more than anything else: a win on Cuba. One of the biggest promises Kennedy made during the election was that Castro was going to be dealt with, removed, crushed, finished. Marcello saw that promise for what it was: an opening, a pressure valve, a place where politics, intelligence, exile rage, and American appetite for deniable violence all met in the same dark room. So, Marcello did what Marcello did. He put his money where power was moving. Millions upon millions, backing Cuban exile operations, funding men and networks that lived in the space between patriot and outlaw. That's where the machinery starts to connect. Marcello began hiring and supporting men who were part of that broader anti-Castro ecosystem, an ecosystem that overlapped with the CIA, the FBI, and the exile world in Florida and New Orleans. The CIA entered the picture through a man named David Ferry, a strange, volatile, useful man who had been part of Marcello's orbit since the 1950s. Ferry wasn't a suit. He was a conduit, someone who could move between worlds, between factions, between conversations that were never supposed to be recorded. And then there was the man who gave it a desk, a letterhead, and a veneer of legitimacy: Guy Banister. Banister was a former FBI agent, the kind of bureau veteran who didn't just remember J. Edgar Hoover, he belonged to Hoover's era. In the FBI, there were only a couple of men who served with that kind of longevity, and Hoover was the symbol of it. Banister carried the same hard hate in his bones. Hate for Castro, and over time, hate for Kennedy. The irony was perfect and poisonous. Kennedy was fighting organized crime publicly, while parts of the anti-Castro world were pulling organized crime into their orbit privately. Everybody had a reason, everybody had a justification, and everybody pretended they weren't doing what they were doing. Both Ferry and Banister had links, direct or adjacent, to the Bay of Pigs network, that sprawling, messy operation that had been run through places like Guatemala, a country with deep connections to the New Orleans Syndicate and to the CIA. Guatemala wasn't just a dot on a map. It was a method. Training camps, cutouts, deniable logistics, a place where American policy could be executed without saying its own name. And the CIA had been using organized crime since the 1950s. That wasn't conspiracy talk. That was practical reality. When you want results without fingerprints, you reach for people who've spent their whole lives leaving no fingerprints. The New Orleans Syndicate wasn't just another tool in that toolbox. It was one of the oldest and most dangerous networks in the country, and it had long-standing ties in business and politics. Sam Zamurray himself, powerful, connected, worked within the same wider New Orleans network that overlapped Marcello's world. In that era, power didn't sit in one building. It circulated, through shipping, through property, through unions, through politicians, through fixers, through men who knew how to make a problem disappear. So when Marcello returned to New Orleans, the board was already set. The government was coming at him like never before. Cuba was the administration's obsession and vulnerability. The CIA was running its own playbook. Exiles were desperate, angry, and increasingly uncontrollable. And in the middle of it, waiting, hungry, needing money, was one young Cuban exile movement built for propaganda, action, and escalation: the DRE. The Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil wasn't just another exile club. It was the kind of organization that thrived in a pressure cooker: young men, political fire, operational ambition, and a willingness to push past boundaries because they believed history owed them. They needed funding. They needed access. They needed patrons. And Marcello, wealthy, targeted, furious, strategic, was looking for leverage in a war where leverage was everything. By the end of 1960, the break wasn't approaching. It had already happened. Castro's revolution hadn't even settled into power before it began tearing itself apart, and the exile world followed the same pattern with muscle memory precision. Cuban politics had always been crowded, intimate, and violent. Too many egos in too small a room. You didn't take men who'd lived by rifles, secrecy, and moral certainty and convert them into orderly administrators just because Havana had new flags. The coalition that brought Castro to power fractured almost immediately, and once the first cracks appeared, independent operations didn't just become possible, they became unavoidable. In September 1960, the CIA learned that a new organization was forming beyond its direct control. The Insurrectional Movement for Revolutionary Recovery, the MIRR. This wasn't a collection of amateurs. Orlando Bosch Avila had been a provincial chief in Castro's own July 26th movement. Victor Paneque Batista, Comandante Diego, had held senior authority in Castro's police apparatus in 1959. These were men who had helped win the revolution, and then rejected what it became. Paneque distrusted the exile leadership Washington was backing, especially the FRD, and he said it bluntly. The CIA was so eager to get married, it picked the wrong bride. He spoke of coordinating loosely with Manuel Artemey's MRR and other dissidents, of infiltrating 90 guerrillas into the Escambray Mountains, territory he knew because he had fought Batista there. The agency listened, but didn't commit. Paneque looked too independent, too self-possessed. There was suspicion he might be a Castro plant. Yet somehow he raised enough money inside the United States to arm 100 men. In that world, money without oversight was never neutral. It was a warning. By the end of the year, Bosch and Paneque were recruiting with help from 2 Americans who lived permanently on the edge of legality: Frank Sturgis, newly returned from Cuba, and Alex Rourke, a television journalist with political connections and a line into the CIA's New York office. The FBI noticed immediately. In December, it informed the CIA that Sturgis was under investigation for potential Neutrality Act violations. The CIA's response was classic ambiguity. It claimed no current interest in the MIRR, while leaving the door open for that to change. Translation: distance today, leverage tomorrow. Bosch continued traveling into Cuba in early 1961, until Castro moved decisively. In March, the regime launched a sweeping counteroffensive. The militia rolled through the Escambray and destroyed most of the guerrilla bands. Paneque later complained that weapons promised by Verona and the FRD never arrived. The exile world absorbed its first brutal lesson. Assurances traveled faster than arms. At the same time, another force re-entered the picture, one with legitimacy, history, and a name that still carried weight inside Cuba. The Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, the DRE, had been one of the original pillars of Castro's coalition. In early 1960, Castro elevated Rolando Cubela to lead the Federation of University Students, and Cubela immediately began purging dissent. Students who resisted the communist turn were expelled, driven underground, or eliminated entirely. 2 of them, Alberto Muller and Manuel Salvat Roque, escaped to the United States in June 1960. With CIA assistance, they rebuilt the DRE in Miami that September. Muller assumed leadership. Salvat took propaganda. Over the next 6 months, the DRE launched radio operations, sabotage, agitation, anything that might ignite a general student strike. When that strike finally erupted in April 1961, the CIA treated the DRE as a megaphone rather than a weapon. Aside from infiltrating Muller and Salvat back into Cuba, the agency provided little operational support. Salvat eventually exfiltrated through Guantanamo. Muller stayed behind and was later captured. The DRE survived, adapted, and learned. 2 years later, It would surface again, publicly, in New Orleans, confronting Lee Harvey Oswald. That confrontation wasn't incidental. It was a flare signaling how propaganda, covert action, and political theater had begun bleeding into each other. As the exile world splintered, Washington's relationship with Havana collapsed entirely. After Nixon's defeat, Eisenhower convened senior advisors on November 29, 1960. Guatemala training camps had already leaked. Eisenhower ordered the operation to continue, provided U.S. sponsorship remained deniable. He misjudged how much Latin America already knew. He'd just met with William Paulley, who urged purging Manuel Artemay from the FRD, expanding the brigade, and placing himself in command. Eisenhower found Paulley extreme but intriguing. Allen Dulles and the cabinet did not. On December 8th, the CIA presented a revised plan to the special group. Preliminary airstrikes from Nicaragua, followed by an exile landing designed to spark uprising. It was approved. 4 days before Kennedy took office, the CIA issued a final assessment, admitting the exile force could not hold territory without U.S. military intervention. Eisenhower told Kennedy the responsibility was now his. Do what was necessary. Kennedy's first Cuba meeting exposed fracture lines immediately. Dick Bissell, Robert Kennedy, McNamara, Maxwell Taylor, Richard Goodwin, Alexis Johnson, Paul Nitzer, and Edward Lansdale all spoke different languages. The CIA talked assets and deniability. Everyone else talked consequences. Robert Kennedy wanted Lansdale to survey the entire problem: assets, weaknesses, psychology. Lansdale had done this before in Vietnam. He was brilliant, unorthodox, and unmanageable. The agencies hated him. That was exactly why Robert Kennedy wanted him. Operation Mongoose was born out of compromise and contradiction. It was labeled a command operation, but real authority remained scattered. The stated objective was clear: overthrow the Cuban regime using all available assets. Robert Kennedy declared it the administration's top priority. John McCone disagreed only on timing. He warned that building resistance inside a police state would be slow and uncertain. As of December 1961, only 28 agents were inside Cuba. 7 more had just been captured and paraded on television. Behind the scenes, the CIA had already taken a different path. Assassination was easier than revolution. While state-drafted contingency memos openly discussing what to do if Castro died violently, CIA officers James O'Connell and William Harvey kept an assassination program alive in total secrecy. Even the CIA director didn't know. Johnny Roselli remained the conduit. Tony Verona re-entered the picture. Poison capsules were delivered. Weapons moved through JM Wave in Miami, overseen by Ted Shackley. When Justice Department officials learned pieces of the operation, they weren't horrified by the concept, only by the recklessness. J. Edgar Hoover was astonished at the use of figures like Sam Giancana. Robert Kennedy shared that concern. The CIA promised restraint. On paper, it sanitized the record. In reality, it transferred control. Harvey lied about shutting Roselli down. Helms supported the deception. McCone remained in the dark. The logic was simple and dangerous. Once authorized, an operation stayed alive until explicitly killed, and nobody wanted to be the one to kill it. Inside Cuba, plots kept collapsing. Confessions aired on television. Conspiracies were rolled up. Still, the machinery ran. By summer 1962, the DRE had outgrown its original role entirely. With thousands of members, offices across the hemisphere, CIA funding for propaganda, and independent arms purchases, it was no longer manageable. Its leaders refused to confine themselves to messaging. They shelled the Sierra Maestra Hotel. They targeted Soviet installations. They took credit publicly. CIA officers admitted privately that control was impossible. At the same time, independent operators multiplied. MIRR drifted out of agency reach. Frank Sturgis, Jerry Hemming, Alex Rourke, Pedro Diaz-Lance, Rolando Masferra, Carlos Prio Socaras, names from different eras, different worlds, began overlapping. Hemming built camps. He recruited Americans and Cubans. He acquired land, boats, and weapons. He moved outside CIA structures deliberately. Organized crime figures circled constantly. Traficante's name appeared everywhere money moved quietly. Hoffa was approached. Lawyers like Frank Regano bridged worlds. No single conspiracy, just a dense ecosystem of convenience. Antonio Vecchiana emerged as the most dangerous figure. Credible, disciplined, and independent. Alpha 66 operated openly and violently, rejecting CIA control while benefiting from the climate the agency had created. Vecchiana promised donors action because Washington wouldn't move. He didn't need permission. Neither did the DRE. By late 1962, the CIA was no longer directing events. It was reacting to them. Kennedy's hesitation radicalized the exile networks. Money, weapons, and ideology fused. Groups that had started as propaganda tools or intelligence assets became autonomous actors. They ran raids. They trained men. They shelled targets that could have triggered war. The DRE was no longer just a student organization. It was a political military force operating in the open, with CIA handlers struggling to catch up. When the missile crisis ended, it didn't restore order. It froze it. Operation Mongoose collapsed under its own contradictions. Assassination tracks remained alive. Exile groups felt betrayed. Organized crime waited patiently. The CIA had built a system it could no longer control, one where intelligence officers like Ted Shackley managed logistics, men like William Harvey handled death, and exile groups like the DRE operated on momentum, not permission. By the end of 1962, control was an illusion. The exile networks weren't instruments anymore, they were players. And once players start believing Washington is weak, they don't stop. They escalate. And they drag everyone else with them. One of the most radical and most dangerous figures inside the DRE was Carlos Bringuier. He was young, volatile, and deeply embedded in networks for older and more powerful than he understood. Bringuier was officially a student revolutionary. In practice, he was operating inside an ecosystem shaped by organized crime, intelligence cutouts, and political warfare. He was close to Sergio Arcacha Smith. He was close to David Ferry. And he was close to Guy Banister, whose office on Camp Street was not just a storage space for weapons and personnel, but an operational hub. Banister's office functioned as a misinformation center, a political warfare shop, a staging ground where ideas were weaponized and men were deployed. Anti-Castro campaigns were conceived there. Anti-Cuba narratives were refined there. And men were sent out from there. Lee Harvey Oswald was one of those men. By the time Oswald re-entered the United States and drifted back into New Orleans, the operation had already been running for years. Multiple attempts to infiltrate Cuba and eliminate Castro had failed. With Oswald's return, and with his renewed proximity to Ferry, something shifted. Oswald wanted to matter. He wanted to be someone. Just as he had once believed that defecting to the Soviet Union would make him important, useful, admired. That fantasy had collapsed in Moscow. The Soviets didn't trust him. They didn't celebrate him. Even after a suicide attempt, all they did was send him to Minsk and put him on a factory floor. He married, had a child, settled into a life that felt like exile within exile. When he came home to the United States, at exactly the moment the war against Castro and the collision between intelligence and organized crime were intensifying. He was primed. Back in New Orleans, Oswald was seen around Banister and Ferry. He began writing to pro-Castro organizations like the Fair Play for Cuba Committee in London and New York. This wasn't random. Oswald understood the world he was circling. His uncle was tied into Carlos Marcello's criminal network. Oswald knew the infrastructure. More importantly, he knew Ferry. Oswald and Ferry went back years. Oswald had been a member of the Civil Air Patrol at the same time Ferry served as his commanding officer. Ferry had encouraged young men to join the Marines, Oswald included. Multiple witnesses later stated they joined because of Ferry's influence. Oswald looked up to him, trusted him, saw him as a mentor, even a father figure. Ferry believed in shaping boys into something harder, sending them into the Marines to come back disciplined, trained, and malleable. A private pipeline, a homemade intelligence farm. Ferry wasn't a fringe eccentric. He was a serious asset inside Marcello's regime, especially in transportation, arms, drugs, Caribbean logistics. He helped build and maintain Marcello's regional network. And now, with Oswald back in New Orleans, Ferry had a project again. Together with Banister and others, Ferry explored new angles for another attempt on Castro. Oswald suddenly made sense. He had already gotten inside the Soviet Union once. He had the right biography, the right contradictions, the right instability. The Mafia had been trying and failing for years to get dependable operatives into Cuba. The island was locked down. Most infiltrators were caught, killed, or burned. Oswald looked like a workaround. They helped him build the persona. They encouraged him to write those letters. They pushed him to hand out fair play for Cuba leaflets in public. They understood that visibility was part of the cover. And this is where Bringuier entered the frame. Bringuier wasn't just a bystander. He was active, loud, and deeply enmeshed in mobilizing Cuban exiles in New Orleans. The record makes that clear. In September 1962, Bringuier and Louis Rabel publicly called for Cuban refugees to volunteer for guerrilla training through the U.S. Army. The message was blunt. Cubans were willing to fight, to die, to prove themselves useful. 2 weeks later, selective service officials announced special registration for Cuban men between 18 and 37. Hundreds showed up. Military training was being discussed openly. The machinery was turning. By December, Bringuier was releasing statements attacking Kennedy directly. He accused the administration of tolerating Soviet colonialism. He warned that Cuban exiles would continue to fight, with or without U.S. approval. By April 1963, he was openly defying U.S. orders to halt raids, denouncing the October missile crisis agreements, and invoking the Bay of Pigs as an unkept promise. This wasn't rhetoric, it was rage. As Kennedy, especially Robert Kennedy, began dismantling organized crime vehicles and shutting down exile operations, men like Bringuier saw the future evaporating. Negotiations with Castro, back-channel discussions, a recognition that the exile war might never be finished, that Cuba might never be returned, that the men funding them, Marcello, Trafficante, the syndicates, were being targeted instead of protected. For the militants, this was betrayal layered on top of betrayal. They didn't just mistrust Kennedy, they despised him. They came to hate him more deeply than they ever hated Castro. Kennedy was the one taking away the money, the protection, the cause. Robert Kennedy was exposing the financial arteries. Who funded what? Who armed whom? Who used exile groups as cutouts across the globe? For men who had already been humiliated once, then used again, then discarded, there was no room left for compromise. If the government wasn't going to shift, then the government itself became the obstacle. If Cuba was lost, and exile was permanent, and the financiers were under siege, then the system had to be broken. By 1963, the hatred had hardened. The networks were already there. The ideology was already locked in. The men had already chosen sides. And for the most radical among them, the conclusion was simple. If Kennedy couldn't be moved, if Kennedy couldn't be pressured, if Kennedy couldn't be bargained with, then Kennedy had to be removed. New Orleans didn't just feel like a crossroads in 1963. It was one. A port city with old money, new hustles, and a shadow economy thick enough to bankroll any kind of politics you wanted, as long as you didn't ask polite questions. It was also, quietly, one of the easiest places in the country to run a Cuba operation without Miami's heat. Miami was watched. New Orleans was a soft zone. The kind of place where a man could be built into something, built up, built out, and, if necessary, built as a fall guy, without anyone admitting they'd touched him. Lee Harvey Oswald walked into that ecosystem in late April like the lights were already on. He didn't drift in by accident. In February, the Oswalds met Ruth Paine, a Quaker pacifist who wanted to learn Russian, exactly the kind of earnest American you could count on to help without seeing the angles. On April 24th, Paine arrived at the Oswalds' Neely Street apartment and found them already packed. Oswald said New Orleans would be better for work. When Paine offered to take in Marina, pregnant again, and baby June in Irving, Oswald took the offer like it was salvation. He cashed in Marina's bus ticket, shipped some belongings ahead, and left for New Orleans alone. Clean, practical, and perfect. His family was now parked safely with someone who would defend them, explain them, normalize them, while Oswald moved freely. In New Orleans, he stayed briefly with his Uncle Dutz Murrett and Aunt Lillian Murrett, found work, found an apartment, and then asked Paine to bring Marina and the baby down. She did. They stayed until September 23rd, when Paine drove Marina and the children back to Irving. Oswald vanished for about 60 hours and then reappeared on a bus between Houston and Laredo, headed for Mexico City. The kind of disappearance that only looks normal if you want it to look normal. During those 5 months, back in the city where he'd lived until age 4, then again on and off from junior high until the Marines, Oswald worked at the Riley Coffee Company until late July. It wasn't a career move. It was a placement. Cleaning industrial coffee machines after having held commercial photography work in Dallas. New Orleans was where he went to become visible in the right places and invisible in the wrong ones. And here's the part that matters in this city. Oswald didn't just become political. He got handled. He got pointed. He got steered into a collision. Because New Orleans had its own gravity. It had Carlos Marcello sitting at the top, one of the richest mob bosses in America, fighting Robert Kennedy and the federal government to stay in the United States and out of prison. Marcello had been indicted on fraud charges tied to a forged birth certificate, with trial scheduled for the fall. Desperate, angry, cornered. And Marcello had operators, men who didn't look like mobsters but made mob things happen. David Ferry was one of them. Ferry was the kind of man you remember even if you don't want to. Born in Cleveland in 1922, college-educated, multiple attempts at priesthood, medical studies, a rare disease that left him hairless, so he wore a striking red wig and false eyelashes. Eastern Airlines hired him as a pilot in 1951 and transferred him to New Orleans. Eddie Rickenbacker praised his work promoting air travel. Ferry was active in the Civil Air Patrol in the early to mid-1950s, socialized with cadets in his home, got forced out after parental complaints about homosexual advances, but still hovered around meetings. He became a rabid right-wing anti-communist, attacking presidents from Roosevelt through Kennedy as soft. He owned his own plane, traveled around the South, and ran on adrenaline and obsession. Between 1959 and 1961, Ferry built an alliance with Sergio Arcacha Smith, head of the New Orleans branch of the Cuban Revolutionary Council. Another exile, Carlos Quiroga, said Ferry supplied Arcacha Smith with funds in $100 bills. Arcacha Smith even wrote Rickenbacker on July 18, 1961, claiming Ferry had revitalized the CRC after the Bay of Pigs and that the re-harassment of Castro has begun. Arcacha begged Easton to grant Ferry paid leave because Ferry supposedly held so many threads tied to Caribbean security that no one could replace him. Rickenbacker refused. Ferry's troubles escalated in August 1961 when he was arrested for homosexual activities with teenage boys, triggering FAA and FBI attention. Ferry told the FBI he helped the CRC obtain food and medicine and denied trying to procure arms, but rumors persisted. In late October, the FBI heard he was trying to buy a C-47 to dispose of an arms cache. In 1967, an informant confirmed Ferry had held weapons, and a young Marine reported Ferry offered to send him to Latin America to prepare for an invasion of Cuba. Carlos Bringuier later told the Times-Picayune Ferry also worked with the New Orleans DRE until the DRE dropped him because of his homosexuality. And Ferry wasn't just a Cuba guy. He was Marcello's guy. In early 1961, he was hired by Marcello, or Marcello's attorney, to shadow Justice Department lawyer John Duiguid in Guatemala, while Duiguid investigated Marcello's fake birth certificate. In early 1962, the Border Patrol heard rumors Ferry had flown Marcello back into the United States in June 1961. Sex charges collapsed in 1962 when witnesses recanted, but Easton began termination proceedings. Marcello's attorney G. Ray Gill represented Ferry in exchange for further help in Marcello's defense. Gill also arranged to use Guy Banister in Marcello's defense. Ferry traveled to Guatemala in 1963. Easton's hearings in summer 1963 failed to reinstate him. He was fired for false statements and moral turpitude. Banister appeared as a character witness. Banister was the other operator, the institutional kind. 20 years in the FBI, retired as special agent in charge of the Chicago office in 1955. 2 years as deputy chief of the New Orleans Police. He helped coordinate 1956 Senate internal security hearings exposing alleged communists. Then he opened a detective agency. His clients included the Louisiana Sovereignty Commission, an apparatus for harassing civil rights activists, and the New Orleans Cuban Revolutionary Council. In 1967, former FBI agent and firearms expert Ivan Nitschke told the DA's office he'd met Cubans in Banister's office in late 1961 looking for arms, and multiple witnesses mentioned meetings with Ferry there. Typist Mary Helen Brengel, who did work tied to Marcello's trial, said she was surprised Banister was helping Marcello. Banister told her Marcello's rights were being violated. That's the environment Oswald entered. And once he arrived, he didn't just wander into Cuba politics. He walked into a structure already crowded with overlapping wars: Cuban exile militancy, organized crime money, intelligence interests, and domestic counterintelligence programs that didn't stay neatly in their lanes. He started writing to V.T. Lee, the national director of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, about forming a chapter in New Orleans. Then he printed handbills, lots of them, announcing his new chapter, and started distributing them in at least 3 locations: Tulane University, around the port of New Orleans, and Canal Street, through May and June 1963. Some of his leaflets used an address that mattered: FPCC, 544 Camp Street. 544 Camp wasn't just an address. It was tied to the corner building where Guy Banister Associates had offices, with a secondary address at 531 Lafayette Street. The New Orleans Cuban Revolutionary Council had also used 544 Camp, though it vacated space by the summer of 1963. The address on Oswald's pro-Castro leaflets sat inside the same anti-Castro world he was supposedly opposing. That wasn't subtle. That was a thumbprint. And it wasn't just paper. Oswald's proximity to Ferry wasn't speculative. After the assassination, Ferry denied everything. No Oswald connection, no Cappy connection, not in Dallas for years. The FBI largely accepted the denial. But Oswald's childhood friend Edward Vobel went on television November 23rd and told agents 2 days later that he and Oswald were in the CAP and Ferry had been their commander. Later, HSCA work found at least 5 people confirming Oswald and Ferry were active in the CAP squadron at Moisant Airport in the second half of 1955, even though Ferry had officially been dropped from CAP. In the 1990s, a photo surfaced clearly showing Ferry and Oswald at a Cappy picnic. The relationship was real. Ferry's phone records, later analyzed from Garrison-era material, showed repeated calls from Dallas, Fort Worth and Houston to Gill's office in 1962 to 63, including multiple calls in 1963, and calls from Houston. Ferry also called numbers in Dallas, Fort Worth, Houston, Miami, and Opa-locka, Florida, whose owners were never identified. Most of November 1963 was missing, but the wiring was unmistakable. Ferry sat in Marcello's defense network and the Cuba network at the same time, with reach into Texas. Now put Oswald's pro-Castro routine back in your mind. It wasn't just politics. It was choreography. In early April 1963, still in Dallas, unemployed and restless, Oswald wrote the FPCC in New York. The letter was theatrical, blunt, underlined in capital letters, "Hands off Cuba. Viva Fidel." He wanted volume, 40 or 60 copies, 5 basic pamphlets. There is no evidence he handed out anything in Dallas, no witnesses, no reports, no trail. What mattered wasn't whether he did it. What mattered was that he wanted it, on record, that he had. New York mailed him literature on April 17th. Within days, he left for New Orleans. It took him 2 weeks to find work. On May 10th, he was hired at Riley Coffee Company, even though he had already won an unemployment appeal and was receiving weekly compensation. Riley was no ordinary employer. Its leadership backed the Information Council of the Americas, INCA, founded by Edward Butler, a private propaganda operation aimed at combating communist influence in Latin America and inside the United States. Butler built INCA to look moderate and disciplined, segregation politics kept out of the public face, while it operated like a communist front in reverse. Recruitment, messaging, exposure, disruption. His leading financial angel was Dr. Alton Ochsner, powerful head of the Ochsner Clinic, extreme right-wing segregationist, conspiratorial, connected. Ochsner helped recruit prominent support, including William B. and H. Eustace Riley. In summer 1963, Butler made contact with Gene Methvin of Reader's Digest, and through him with General Edward Lansdale, Operation Mongoose, and perhaps with Frank Hand of the CIA, detailed to Butler. Butler spoke openly about building a conflict corporation and training conflict managers, operators who would infiltrate groups, fracture them, divert them, create internal dissension. Years later, he described it proudly: infiltration, disruption, manipulation. Now look at Oswald in that setting. He rents an apartment on Magazine Street. Marina and the child join him days later. On May 26th, he escalates, writes New York again, asks for a charter, bulk literature, talks about renting an office, prices it, $30 a month, 1 unemployment check, wants a photograph of Fidel. He wants official. New York replies cautiously. They warn him. Hostile territory. Use a P.O. box. Avoid provocation. A real chapter needs real members. Oswald answers immediately and ignores the advice. He tells them he already printed 2,000 circulars. He admits they're provocative. That was the point. He says even if the office lasts only a month, it's still worth it. More people will hear about the FPCC than if it never existed. There was no office. There were handbills. He ordered them locally, using the name Osborne. One printer later failed to recognize him from photographs. Another identified him clearly and remembered the alias Lee Osborne. That discrepancy never made it into the Warren report. While working at Riley, Oswald spends lunch breaks in the adjacent Crescent City garage reading gun magazines and talking firearms. He tries to buy a carbine. At the same time, he prepares to travel again. He applies for a new passport on June 24th and receives it within days. He and Marina discuss returning to the Soviet Union. He keeps leafleting Tulane, the port area, Canal Street. And he is noticed. A Cuban refugee named Rafael Aznares, an accountant for Likes Brothers, a company damaged by Castro's revolution, argues with Oswald on Canal Street and writes directly to J. Edgar Hoover, enclosing one of Oswald's flyers and demanding action. The letter reaches FBI headquarters. It's logged, and nothing happens. No follow-up, no local inquiry, no action on record. That silence matters. By late July, Oswald loses his job at Riley. Within days, he starts seeking out Cuban exiles directly. He collects addresses. 3 Cuban stores go into his address book. One belongs to Carlos Bringuier, head of the New Orleans branch of the DRE. The DRE wasn't a local club. It had branches across American cities, including New Orleans, while offices in Miami and Latin American capitals coordinated propaganda, recruitment, and fundraising. It was covertly funded by the CIA. The CIA wanted it confined to propaganda. The DRE wanted to strike directly at Castro. After its shelling of Havana on August 25, 1962, it was determined to preserve a militant role. It used Miami Mafia contacts to procure arms. When propaganda starts buying hardware, it stops being propaganda. And by late 1962, the Kennedy administration began cracking down on independent exile military activities, demanding training bases be moved outside the United States. Miami got watched hard. New Orleans didn't. The lower Mississippi Delta became an alternative staging area. The FBI and customs offices were far less vigilant than Miami's, and operations detected in Louisiana didn't suffer profound consequences. A soft zone. Cuban exile activity there had been linked since at least 1960 to organized crime connections and deep pockets. And in May 1962, journalist William Stuckey had already written in the States item that local Cubans were raising money and sending arms to Florida through soldiers of fortune and ex-Marines. Figures that evidently included Jerry Patrick Hemming and former CIA asset Lawrence Laborde, who was trying to acquire a boat in the area. Hemming wanted to build a training camp in Louisiana and was trying to affiliate with the DRE. That's the background. That's the heat under the floorboards. Now Oswald walks into Bringuier's store in early August. On August 1st, Oswald writes New York again, claims his office was shut down, blames remodeling, says Cuban exiles, gusanos, attacked one of his demonstrations and police warned him off. He claims thousands of circulars were distributed. Some of it true, some not, tone defiant, role intact. On August 5th, Oswald enters Bringuier's clothing store while Bringuier is collecting donations with 2 teenage Americans. Oswald introduces himself and immediately contradicts his public posture. He speaks as an anti-Castro militant. He offers to help train men. He talks sabotage, demolitions, and homemade weapons. He asks questions that cut too close. And most revealing, according to the teenagers present, he asks whether the DRE is connected to the Cosa Nostra. The timing is perfect. Joe Valachi has just gone public. The phrase is everywhere. Oswald uses it casually, like he's testing the wiring. Bringuier later claims he suspected Oswald immediately, an infiltrator, an informer. But early versions of the story vary, and the teenagers flatly deny that Oswald offered to fight Castro or train Cubans. They remember the mob question. That sticks because it isn't ideological, it's operational. Then Oswald makes sure there are witnesses. On August 9th, he stands on Canal Street with a placard, Viva Fidel. Bringuier is alerted and comes running with other exiles. They confront Oswald publicly. Shouting, crowd, police, arrests. Everyone goes in. Oswald stays calm. Too calm. A police lieutenant later says it looked staged. In jail, Oswald talks. He exaggerates, invents members, misstates his political awakening, omits Russia, claims leadership. Then he asks to see the FBI. An agent arrives. Oswald feeds him a story, fanciful, inflated, about his FPCC activities. He mentions an imaginary organizer, A.J. Hidell, his favorite alias. He places himself inside a structure that doesn't exist. The FBI files a report and makes no recommendations. He bonds out through political connections. Next move, publicity. He writes New York again, encloses the summons, brags about coverage, promises more trouble. The national director doesn't reply. By now, it's obvious. Oswald isn't building a chapter. He's burning one, turning it into a spectacle designed to be documented, repeated, and weaponized. On August 16th, he hires 2 men to leaflet with him at the Trade Mart. Television cameras show up. That night, a Cuban exile visits Oswald's apartment, ostensibly to join the FPCC. Oswald immediately identifies him as a likely informant. He's right. And this is where the DRE stops being just a group Oswald fights with, and becomes the machine that locks him into place. Within days, journalist William Stuckey and Ed Butler of Inca move in. Butler specializes in exposure, discrediting, psychological warfare. Oswald is perfect for it. On August 17th, Stuckey interviews Oswald on television. Oswald is controlled, articulate, calm. He doesn't look like a radical. That's the hook. Then comes the radio debate. Stuckey notifies the FBI beforehand. The Bureau takes note. Oswald goes on air opposite Bringuier and Butler. The program is framed as education. What it becomes is an operation. Butler arrives armed with clippings. On air, Oswald is exposed as a former defector to the Soviet Union. The revelation is surgical. It destroys his credibility and, more importantly, taints the FPCC by association. It accomplishes exactly what COINTELPRO-style disruption was designed to do, without fingerprints. Afterward, something changes. Oswald relaxes. He drinks with Stuckey. He mocks Soviet life, criticizes corruption, speaks like a man who's completed a run. The tension is gone. And the pattern is unmistakable. A fake chapter, provocative leaflets, a public arrest, official contact, media amplification, final discrediting, clean exit. The FBI's behavior reinforces it. No aggressive follow-up. No serious investigation. Reports filed late, incomplete, stripped of context. Washington asks for more. New Orleans gives the minimum. This wasn't happening in a vacuum. While Oswald is performing his pro-Castro theater, Louisiana hosts real anti-Castro operations tied to the DRE, organized crime elements, right-wing money, and weapons. In the 3rd week of July 1963, right in the middle of Oswald's public FPCC routine, the FBI discovers a plan to bomb Cuba from a staging area near New Orleans. The tip comes from Orlando Pedroso Amores, a Miami Cuban who says he inspected practice bombs filled with sand at a Louisiana house. The men expected 2 B-26 aircraft, plus dynamite and fuses to make real bombs. Pedroso says the DRE is behind the plan. The CIA immediately denies any connection. Justice orders an FBI investigation. Pedroso describes 3 Cubans who drove him. 2 from Miami, 1 from New Orleans. The station wagon is traced to a Miami rental made by a DRE member named John Koch, Gene Koch, as he preferred. Koch appears on a CIA list of DRE infiltrators for a November 1961 operation and attended the World Youth Festival in Helsinki with other DRE members in July 1962. On July 23rd, U.S. Customs spots the rented Chevrolet with 3 prominent DRE members inside: Victor Espinosa Hernandez, Carlos Hernandez Sanchez, and Jose Basulto Leon. Hernandez and Basulto were part of the August 1962 raid on Havana. Espinosa and Hernandez were arrested in Florida in early June 1963 as they prepared a bombing raid on a Havana oil refinery. This Louisiana operation is the kind of independent action the CIA told the DRE not to conduct. Yet the New Orleans FBI shows a remarkable lack of urgency. Even with Pedroso providing enough detail to locate the site, agents initially don't bother determining who owns the property. Pedroso refuses to sign an affidavit for a warrant, but agrees to accompany agents. They find a padlocked trailer rented in Chicago. On July 31st, agents search and discover 20 practice bombs, 25 homemade fuses, 26 striker assemblies, primer cord, blasting caps, and a 50-pound bag of Nudoex, used to turn gasoline into napalm. Inside the trailer are 48 cases of dynamite, each case 50 pounds, each holding 25 sticks. The property is co-owned by William Julius McClaney, who worked at the Hotel Nacional Casino before Castro, and whose brother Mike was part owner. The key operator is Victor Espinosa Hernandez. Long revolutionary history, connected to original DRE procurement networks in 1957 to 58, trained in Guatemala in 1960 to 61, infiltrated in and out of Cuba during 1961, held a CIA cryptonym AMHINT-25, and whose CIA operational approval lapsed in May 1963, 2 months before the dynamite trailer surfaces. In 1963, Espinosa denied that Mike McClaney financed the operation and denies he drove the trailer. Koch and Hernandez deny DRE involvement. The FBI accepts the denials, drops the DRE from the case caption, and no one is arrested. That conclusion doesn't age well. In 1978, Espinosa admits Mike McClaney funded the operation and that he purchased weapons from Richard Lockley, an arms dealer in Collinsville, Illinois, tied to the John Birch Society and the Minutemen. Lockley sold weapons to multiple Cuban groups in Miami, sometimes through Hemming. Espinosa eventually acknowledges he drove the trailer to Louisiana. The DRE man from New Orleans whom Pedroso met is never identified. Bringuier, the New Orleans DRE head, is never questioned. Mike McClaney isn't just a random businessman. He claims famous sports acquaintances, including Baltimore Colts owner Carroll Rosenblum, who helped finance part of McClaney's interest in the National and took losses when casinos shut. McClaney tells HSCA he played golf with JFK and Joseph P. Kennedy in Palm Springs and was involved in high-stakes games with Yankees co-owner Dan Topping. He denies mob ties, denies paying off Batista, but tells HSCA bluntly what he thinks of Castro. SOB should be killed. He acknowledges helping exiles, including Tony Verona, the same Verona in the Rosselli assassination pipeline. Another player is Sam Benton, a private investigator born in Poland who lived in Cuba. Questioned in August 1963, Benton admits helping Espinosa look for a bomber and acknowledges knowing Juan Orta, associate of Carlos Prio Socaras, the man recruited into poison schemes against Castro in late 1960. Benton lies about where Espinosa's funds came from. That's the pattern. Money laundered through politics. Politics laundered through patriotism. Operations laundered through denials. And the dynamite plot is only one of 2 major exile operations in Louisiana that summer. The second is a training camp in Lacombe, Louisiana, tied to Victor Paneque Batista, Comandante Diego, working with the Christian Democratic Movement under Laureano Batista Falla. The MDC makes a unity pact with Commandos L under Tony Cuesta to make naval and airstrikes. They seek $50,000 from Prio and talk to the DRE about joining. Everyone is shopping for allies. Everyone is shopping for money. The CIA wants control. The militants want action. Louisiana is quiet enough to let them pretend they have both. MDC leaders meet Nicaraguan dictator Luis Somoza, who offers a base. Their logic is classic provocation. Run raids, provoke retaliation, create a pretext for intervention. But before those negotiations settle, they move into the lower Mississippi Delta. On July 18th, an MDC member tells the CIA 13 men are training on a ranch in Mississippi, pending transfer to Nicaragua. Days later, 9 more men leave for New Orleans bound for a nearby camp. Diego recruits in Chicago. A CIA memo later quotes a June 25, 1963, report describing a camp 15 miles from New Orleans, after crossing a very long bridge right at entrance of state of Louisiana, on a ranch owned by an American millionaire group, defraying expenses and providing equipment. The millionaires are never identified. On September 1st, J.M. Wave receives a call. One campman, Fernando José Barcena, has been caught writing to Carlos Lechuga, a Cuban communist diplomat and UN ambassador. Barcena is hauled to Miami. Batista Falla's group starts beating a confession out of him. J.M. Wave alerts the FBI. Agents free Barcena. He repudiates much of what he said under duress. The incident reaches Bringuier, suggesting the New Orleans DRE has contact with the camp too. The New Orleans FBI learns of the camp through informants in late July, but accepts a cover story about a lumber operation in Guatemala run by Rudolph Richard Davis. Agent Warren DeBruys doesn't bother visiting the camp and sets the case aside in early August. He interviews Davis on October 2nd, files a report, and is satisfied. 4 years later, Davis tells a different story in Houston. The camp was established on the Delabar estate, with help from the John Birch Society, so prominent members could witness training. Davis also claims he met Oswald twice in New Orleans in 1963, once while leafleting and once at Oswald's apartment, seeking information about Oswald's pro-Castro activity. No one pursues the connection. So, by summer 1963, anti-Castro groups operate in Louisiana, with support from gambling-connected figures like Mike McClaney, from wealthy arch-conservatives who remain unnamed, and inside a city dominated by Marcello, whose operators include Ferry and Banister. Marcello had been involved in CIA mafia plots against Castro from the beginning. It would have been consistent for him to encourage operations launched from his own territory. And there's a thread that keeps returning. Retaliation and assassination logic didn't belong to one side. It belonged to the ecosystem. In 1976, Edward P. Morgan, a Washington criminal attorney with deep FBI and congressional credentials, told the Church Committee that Roselli had heard, after an assassination squad was captured in Havana in March 1963, Castro wanted retaliation against Kennedy. Morgan then said he'd heard startling information from a client relevant to that matter and referenced this New Orleans man. A month later, when Roselli returned for his final interview, counsel suddenly asked about Carlos Marcello. Roselli denied any Marcello role in assassination plots against Castro, the president, or Robert Kennedy, but the implication hung there. Now take Oswald's New Orleans arc and put it where you put all the other moving parts, right in the center. Since late 1962, Oswald tries to establish relationships with Communist Party USA, the Socialist Workers' Party, and then the FPCC, 3 COINTELPRO targets. Yet there is no evidence he has meaningful personal contact with actual leftist activists. That raises the question, is he trying to join or trying to create the appearance of joining? Is he acting as an agent of disruption, whether for the Bureau, private right-wing operators, or as a useful idiot whose movements fit their playbook perfectly? The DRE is positioned to collide with him. CIA officers monitor it because it's becoming harder to control. Its money and operational wiring runs through the same underworld channels that keep showing up in exile operations. Oswald's relationship to the DRE isn't just a street fight. In the context of this city, it functions like a setup. The DRE becomes the instrument that helps lock his persona in place. Publicly pro-Castro, documented, broadcast, discredited, and tagged. The same group running in the background, bomb plots, arms channels, rogue operations, now has a perfect villain in the foreground, a face, a name, a paper trail, a radio tape. Oswald's key moves align with the broader pattern: public provocation, official contact, media amplification, foreign travel attempt. He secures a new passport in July. He stages the DRE confrontation in early August. He asks for the FBI in jail and inflates his story. He debates on air. On September 17th, he obtains a tourist visa. A week later, he leaves, apparently without telling Marina where he's going. In Mexico City, he tries and fails to get an immediate visa to Cuba. Then he comes back into the American story again, like a man returning to base. And the timing tightens around him. Oswald's return from Mexico and re-entry by bus intersects with a country suddenly obsessed with organized crime in public. The day he gets back onto that bus is the day Joe Valachi testifies before Congress. Then in October, Valachi goes national on television. The word Cosa Nostra becomes mainstream. The country learns the vocabulary. The newspapers print it. Oswald had already dropped it casually in Bringier's shop, asking whether the DRE was connected to the mob like he was checking a circuit with his finger. By November, Kennedy is dead. In that compression of time, late September into October into November, the DRE's situation also tightens. By their own record, the DRE is drifting into rogue action, carrying out operations the CIA says not to conduct. Its contacts and supply lines run through organized crime gravity and right-wing money. Exposure threatens the pipeline. Without the pipeline, there's no money. Without money, there's no operations. And in that world, survival isn't a committee vote. It's removal. It's disruption. It's getting Kennedy out of the way, the same direction Marcello is pushing from the top. So, Oswald comes out of New Orleans with 3 things welded to him: a public pro-Castro persona, a documented collision with the DRE, and a trail of official contacts and media artifacts that can be replayed on command. And you can see the architecture if you stop looking at his summer like a political awakening and start looking at it like a build. A man arrives in a permissive city. His family is parked safely with a respectable sponsor. He takes a dead-end job inside a company tied to private propaganda warfare. He prints provocative leaflets stamped with an address connected to anti-Castro operators. He seeks out exile militants and asks about the mob at the exact moment the mob becomes national language. He stages a public confrontation, gets arrested, asks for the FBI, inflates his role, then steps into broadcast studios where his Soviet past is exposed in a way that discredits him and stains the organization he claims to represent. Then he tries to get into Cuba. If the stated goal was always to build a persona credible enough to enter Cuba and take a shot at Castro, the logic tracks. A pro-Castro activist trying to reach Havana through Mexico makes sense on paper. But what Oswald doesn't recognize was what's moving behind him. the DRE's rogue trajectory, the money channels, the exposure risk, the Marcello war with Kennedy, the private propaganda machinery, and the way a public persona can be used as a weapon once it's documented. By August and early September, witnesses place him in Clinton, Louisiana, seeking work, attempting to register to vote, appearing near figures later linked to intelligence and organized crime. The sightings come from across political lines and are later found credible. What he's doing there remains unresolved. But it fits the same pattern. Movement without friction, visibility where it helps, invisibility where it would hurt. By late September, he leaves New Orleans for Mexico City, toward Cuba again, through a different door. When he returns, the country is watching mob testimony on television, and the air is thick with the kind of language Oswald has already been using. Weeks later, Kennedy is assassinated, and the tape, Oswald's tape, plays perfectly. New Orleans didn't make him a killer. It made him legible. It gave him a role, a script, a set of co-stars, Bringuier, the DRE, Ferry, Banister, plus the off-screen machinery, exile operations, dynamite trailers, millionaires with no names, arms dealers with extremist connections, mob-adjacent money, and federal agencies that filed reports and somehow never followed the obvious leads. By the time Oswald leaves New Orleans, he isn't just a man with opinions. He's a package, labeled, recorded, and ready to be delivered. And when the country needs a face, the DRE already has one. By the end of 1962, the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil wasn't just difficult, it was radioactive. The DRE closed out the year attacking President Kennedy in print and forcing the CIA to swap out its case officer. Ross Crozier was gone. His replacement was George Joannides, working the account under the alias Walter Newby. The change didn't calm anything. It formalized a split that was already there. In February, the DRE published a Cuban report blasting Robert McNamara and insisting Soviet missiles were still on the island. That same month, the group's leader, Luis Fernandez Rocha, told the agency flatly that the DRE intended to resume armed raids against Cuba. Miami's reply was blunt. The United States would not permit it. Fernandez went public anyway. On April 1st and 2nd, he accused the CIA of betraying the DRE, of being responsible for Alberto Muller's arrest inside Cuba, and for the Bay of Pigs, disaster itself. The message was simple. If Washington wouldn't fight, the DRE would. Alone, if necessary. Langley tried to hold the line. Headquarters instructed J.M. Wave not to sever the relationship over rhetoric. No termination without an overt act. Words were tolerated. Action would not be. But the warning signs kept stacking up. In late August, CIA headquarters received a tip from Richard Kane, a Chicago informant with law enforcement credentials and deep mafia ties. Kane reported that a DRE representative had approached a local sheriff's investigator, also tied to organized crime, about joining a guerrilla force intended to operate somewhere in Latin America. The investigator said he would do nothing without U.S. government authorization. The DRE operative called Miami. The response came from Manuel Salvat Roque, the DRE's volatile military chief. Salvat claimed they weren't backed by the CIA at all, but by the Pentagon. That single claim hit like a thrown match. If it was true, it meant the DRE had an alternate channel. If it was false, it meant they were willing to invoke one to recruit men and scare skeptics into compliance. Either way, it meant the organization was now talking like it had cover it didn't want written down. And the contradiction kept running. Despite repeated CIA warnings, the DRE continued receiving agency funds for propaganda in the United States and Latin America. a political asset, still on the payroll, drifting toward paramilitary autonomy. That was the nightmare version of a controlled relationship. In early September, the DRE arranged a radio debate with American students who had returned from Cuba under the auspices of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. The format was familiar. The purpose was unmistakable. It mirrored what had already played out in New Orleans weeks earlier, where Carlos Bringuier, the head of the DRE's local chapter, had confronted Lee Harvey Oswald on radio and television. It wasn't coincidence. It was method. Then came the C Magazine incident. On September 12th, J.M. Wave reported that the November issue of C was already hitting Miami newsstands. The cover showed Fidel Castro under the headline, "Wanted, dead or alive, $10 million reward." Inside was a recruitment pitch, "The CIA needs men, can you qualify?" and a statement attributed to Fernandez claiming the reward money had already been deposited in Banco Santo Domingo. The CIA demanded answers. The DRE denied authorizing the ad. Weeks later, the Miami Herald ran new stories quoting DRE officials complaining about CIA refusal to support raids, complaints those same officials immediately denied to Joanides. The organization was now speaking in two voices, neither one controlled. Public defiance for the exile street, private denials for the agency handler. The gap wasn't just widening, it was being used. The breaking point came on October 22nd. That day, the DRE formally presented Joanides with a plan to establish a military base on a Caribbean island, its name redacted in the record. On November 8th, Joanides sent a long cable reviewing a year of deterioration. The agency had terminated support for DRE military operations back in March and warned that any new raids would result in a total cut-off. The warning didn't land. The DRE was watching the exile ecosystem shift. With Manuel Rey's bases emerging in Central America, the DRE feared losing relevance in what it believed was a renewed U.S. push to eliminate Castro. So it wanted its own autonomous platform, Martha, near Trinidad, a base to infiltrate small teams into Cuba without oversight. Joanides shut it down. The DRE lacked the skills and discipline for autonomous warfare. The base was too distant. American involvement would surface immediately. The budget would explode, from $20,000 a month into the hundreds of thousands. And the DRE itself was unreliable. Joanides didn't mince words. A freewheeling AMSPELL asset with a chameleon sense of loyalty and open contempt for the US government was the wrong basket for an autonomous force. In the exile community, the DRE was already known as both enfant gâté and enfant terrible, spoiled, dangerous, and proud of it. Joanides recommended total rejection. Permission was granted. On November 19th, he delivered the verdict in person. He suggested the DRE ally with Manuel Artime, ideologically compatible, based outside the United States, already equipped for operations. Halfway through the briefing, Fernandez smiled. Then he laughed. "I knew you were going to say that." No argument, no protest. Cordial ending. But what Joanides didn't know, or couldn't officially acknowledge, was that the DRE had already started building alternate patronage. William Pawley, Claire Booth Luce, and others who didn't run through J.M. Wave. While Fernandez was getting nowhere in Miami, the DRE was working Dallas. On October 13th, 1963, the DRE held a fundraising meeting at a bank in a North Dallas shopping center. The speakers were Manuel Salvat, still dangerous, still angry, Ana Silveira, another Miami representative, and Martinez de Pinillo, publisher of the DRE's bi-weekly Cuban report. The Dallas Morning News gave it a friendly preview. General Edwin Walker attended. During that trip, Salvat was introduced to Fermín de Goycochea Sanchez, a Bay of Pigs veteran. Salvat wanted arms, enough to equip multiple PT boats. He wanted speed. He wanted volume. The deal didn't close, but the intent was unmistakable. By now, the DRE had become exactly what CIA officers feared: motivated, uncontrolled, and furious. It didn't need permission anymore. It needed resources and a narrative that kept it relevant. That atmosphere matters because it frames Oswald's movements. By the summer of 1963, the CIA had multiple officers tracking the DRE's volatility: Ted Shackley at JM Wave, William Harvey watching darker channels, and Ioannidis trying to contain a political asset slipping toward paramilitary autonomy. Inside that environment, Brangier operated in New Orleans, connected to the DRE's internal bitterness, exposed to exile militancy, aware of the organization's anger toward Kennedy. So when Oswald crossed his path, it wasn't accidental. It was inevitable. And the mechanism was already built. Oswald's New Orleans episode, his pro-Castro leaflets, his street confrontation, his radio and television appearances, was exactly the kind of public artifact a militant exile organization could weaponize. It gave them a frame. It gave them a villain. It gave them something they could point to when the next crisis hit. After the assassination, the reaction was immediate and coordinated.